Chris Benoit is here, and he's really mad. Chris Benoit is here, and he's really angry. Here it is in full, the Chris Benoit song. Isn't any wrestler who can prove him wrong?
What?
Got him! Got him!
These videos are satiric reviews. You don't have to agree, but don't bitch about it.
Hey there, I'm Social Injustice Warrior V Infuso, and today we're going to take a look back at the life of Chris Benoit. And I want to make it clear that today we're only going to be covering his career in this episode. Next month's video is the one that's going to detail what came after. There's also a few parts of Benoit's career that you may feel I've glossed over or only briefly mentioned, but that's because there's a video coming out next year on this channel about Benoit's time in certain stables. So with that being said, let's start. Benoit's fascination with wrestling would begin with him idolizing the Dynamite Kid, who is someone we may talk about later on this channel, though I can't imagine saying too many favorable things about him. Then again, I am currently making a video on a guy who is known both in and out of the ring as the Crippler, so we'll see. Dynamite Kid had such an impact on Benoit that when he first came into a ring, he'd adopt the Dynamite moniker and use of his flying headbutt.
Use your head.
But I don't want to use my head!
Benoit would train at the Hart family dungeon and at the New Japan dojo, where his training regimens were nightmare-inducing. Words cannot properly describe the hellish nature of his routines, both physically and mentally.
I went for a spin kick, and I missed. But only missed to the point where no one would see it because Chris bumped so fast. After the match was done, I went looking for him. I found him in the boiler room doing squats. He did 500 squats. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "You know, I never should have bumped off that. That was so unprofessional of me, and that was such a bad rookie mistake." So it's like purging himself for making that mistake.
I mean, I think there may be like this perfectionist thing, or maybe he held himself to a, you know, and that's probably why he was so good, is that he held himself to a standard that probably was unattainable.
But it was this strict upbringing that he'd try to indoctrinate onto others.
No, Benoit, open up the shower. Did you work out today?
One time we went to a Bob Evans. Benoit, Jamie, Bob. I was sitting next to Brian. What can we get your order? He's like, steak, 20 egg whites, toast, dry, tomato. And then go to me. I was like, I don't want to get beat up. I'll have egg whites. Like, I just need like 6 of them. I'll just take the little steak. Like, you'll take the big one. I'll take the big one. And then Brian's like, big stack of flapjacks and butter and syrup and whipped cream and all this shit. And Benoit like reaches across the table.
Give me the number 7.
He's like, no. Scratch, he's not ordering that. Give him what I had. No, he's not ordering that. No, give him what I had. He was like, "Oh, I'll kill you." Like, that's what he was saying with his eyes. "I will kill you." No, he wasn't saying that. It was all work out with you.
You see me, man, I can't even finish a sandwich. This motherfucker made me choke down every last pukey egg.
He'd spend 4 years with Stampede Wrestling as Dynamite Chris Benoit, and 8 years with New Japan Pro Wrestling as the Pegasus Kid. Which honestly sounds a lot less like a wrestler and a lot more like a My Little Pony character, but sure, I mean, hey, you do you. You do you. During his time at NJPW, he was putting on highly acclaimed matches with Jushin Liger and a masked wrestler known as Black Tiger, who was betrayed by the legendary Eddie Guerrero. The two would form a lifelong friendship after Chris accidentally knocked Eddie out in the middle of a match. And aw, I love meet cutes. How could you not? With the company, he won his first major championship, becoming the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion, and would eventually become the WWF Light Heavyweight Champion. Wait, what the fuck did I just say? Yeah, apparently that title's been active a lot longer than the company would have you believe, spending its initial days being defended off US grounds.
WCW, where the big boys play.
In 1992, Benoit would make his way to WCW, where he did nothing of note before heading to ECW in 1994. It was there he would earn the name of the Crippler, for the way that he'd take opponents out of commission. This name would unfortunately prove to be true when he nearly crippled Sabu at November to Remember, which, now that I'm thinking about it, is a pretty properly named show. I don't think either man will forget this anytime soon. Benoit would remain cold and calculated in his promos, speaking in a slow, monotone voice, while rubbing his hands together in a menacing manner, which was allegedly inspired by his former mentor, Stu Hart. Benoit would team with Dean Malenko, who much like Eddie would become one of Chris's best friends. The two would win the ECW tag team titles off the team of Taz and Sabu, and would join Shane Douglas in his stable, the Triple Threat. The team at one point in time held every title in the company, with Dean Malenko also holding the ECW TV title, and Shane Douglas holding the ECW World Championship. Unfortunately, despite the success, the stable wasn't made to last. But don't weep for them, as Shane Douglas would reform the team many times over without either man. I guess it's kind of like Axl Rose and Guns N' Roses. You know, he doesn't need anybody in the background. You can just put him in the front and he's going to call it Guns N' Roses. We know it's not, but he's going to continue to bark up that tree. I gotta stop with these references. Benoit and Malenko would feud with the likes of the Public Enemy and the Steiner brothers. And just imagine that for 1 second. Benoit, Malenko, and the Steiner brothers. I mean, just imagine the potatoes thrown in that match. There's no way all four men left that ring without welts. Benoit's tenure would come to an end when his work visa expired. What with him being a Canadian and all. Sorry if I didn't mention that earlier. Very into the Maple Leaf. Apparently, Paul Lee was supposed to renew it, but failed to do so. And no, Paul Lee failing to do something he was supposed to do? Say it ain't so! Benoit would leave the country, touring Japan for a short amount of time, before he'd return to the WCW in 1995, as NJPW and WCW began a talent exchange of sorts. He'd mostly be booked against his former rivals from NJPW until he was offered a spot in one of the most legendary stables in wrestling history, the Four Horsemen. In what was my personal favorite incarnation of the team, I know, hate me in the comments, but I thought that group was at their best when Benoit stood side by side with Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, and Brian Pillman. Pillman at this time would begin a feud with Kevin Sullivan that would end prematurely when Pillman left the company, so in his place Benoit was transitioned into the feud. The feud began with minor tension between the two, which would only be exasperated when Benoit would begin an on-screen affair with Sullivan's manager and wife, Woman. Now, I want to point out that in addition to being a pro wrestler, Kevin Sullivan doubled as one of the company's bookers. And this was a time where wrestling was known to be fake.
He used that word. He used that F word, and I was watching him, and I just thought to myself, you don't belong in the wrestling business. And I know a lot of guys out there that those are fighting words.
Oh, I'm sorry, scripted. God, please, don't hurt me. But there were still elements that officials wanted fans to believe were real. They wanted to blur the line and tear down the fourth wall so that the audience at home wouldn't know what was real and what was fake. A great example of this, ironically, would be Brian Pillman's loose cannon gimmick. Anyway, the point is, Kevin Sullivan wanted the audience to believe what they were seeing was real. So in the interest of realism, Sullivan demanded Benoit and Woman, real name Nancy, spend plenty of time together off camera. This way, if they were ever seen by fans, they'd be seen together. Maybe even being photographed or filmed together just to stir up some drama for WCW watchers. He'd force them to do things like share hotel rooms and hold hands in public. See, now this would be an interesting plan if it wasn't for the following three issues. 1. No one cared. No one cared about Kevin Sullivan as a character, and Benoit was hardly promoted enough for fans to engage and enthrall themselves in this story the way that Sullivan would have liked. 2. No one believed this was real, as Kevin was known for this style of booking, so even those behind the scenes were under the impression that all that took place in this feud was entirely fictitious.
Number 3.
Kevin pretty much booked his wife's affair. In what is a classic case of life imitating art, after being forced to spend a prolonged amount of time together, Nancy and Chris would actually begin seeing each other, and an on-screen relationship would turn into a real-life affair. One could only imagine that Kevin Sullivan was into being cucked before it became a fad.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. Not at all.
And despite this revelation, no one listened to a complaining Sullivan, because all those backstage believed that he was just selling the story. Regardless, Sullivan and Benoit's feud would persist, leading to an eventual retirement match, with the loser leaving WCW. Astonishingly, this wouldn't lead to the end of Benoit's tenure with the company, but would instead end Kevin's time as an active wrestler. He'd leave in-ring activity so that he could focus mainly on booking. And could you imagine that? Having a very public affair with your boss's wife and managing to keep your job after the fact? Man, office parties must have been weird. Benoit would eventually find himself in a best-of-7 series with Booker T to determine who the better competitor was, and who would go on to face Fit Finlay for his TV title. The two traded wins, bringing out the best in each other and elevating both men's place in the company. Both Booker and Benoit left the feud looking stronger and having more eyes on them than they had going into it. Booker would win the feud and go on to later defeat the Belfast Bruiser to become WCW's television champion. Following the loss, Benoit would again team with Dean Malenko to win the WCW Tag Team Championships, and join the Four Horsemen for a second time, pitting the team with Flair and Mongo. This would be the very last incarnation of this group, not including Evolution or Fortune, which were teams that were clearly inspired by the stable. The stable didn't last very long together, and things would end with Chris Benoit winning the WCW United States Championship and teaming back up with Shane Douglas. The former Triple Threat would reunite, adding Perry Saturn to their faction to form the Revolution. The group would start out as a bunch of workers who were tired of being held down by the company. This was both a work and a shoot, a gimmick and reality. The team would later become an anti-government group who were making their own country. Yeah, okay. Guys, lots of luck with that, really. After leaving the group not approving of the gimmick change, he'd regain his United States Championship and win the television title for the first time. One of the more notable moments from his WCW career came when he was handpicked to face Bret Hart at the Owen Hart tribute show, in a match that was already emotional due to the circumstances of it, now being amplified by a performance to remember. They put on what I believe could be one of both men's best matches, causing the arena to break out in a standing ovation, with Harley Race of all people coming in to hug both. In January of 2000, Benoit did the unthinkable when he beat Sid Vicious for the WCW Championship. Now some of you may be thinking, V, what are you talking about? Benoit won many championships throughout his time with the company. And you're not wrong. But you are pushy, so I'm going to ask you to sit back down and shut up because this is my video, not yours. Benoit did win a lot of titles with WCW. But the titles that were won were mid-card titles, which is where the company saw him, as a higher mid-card talent, whereas the main event was mostly reserved for guys who'd already been successful somewhere else. This was his first main event title win. After all his years of fighting to be seen as an end-of-the-card guy, his destiny was finally met after years of blood, sweat, and tears. So of course naturally he left the company the next day. You see, Benoit was upset with the company and their creative direction. He felt that his title win came too little too late, and that it was only presented to him because he was leaving. And he wasn't wrong. This was an admitted last-ditch effort to keep Benoit employed as opposed to losing him to the WWF. Benoit left the company in protest of Kevin Sullivan being promoted to head booker, feeling that if he worked under him, he'd handicap his career. And gee, Chris, I wonder why he'd do such a thing to you. I mean, it's not like you did anything to... Oh, wait. After the match, Kevin Nash would confront Benoit, cutting this very appropriate promo.
Whoa! Wait a minute. Mr. Commissioner, I just want to say something here, Mr. Canadian Hero. Enjoy that belt for another hour and 40 minutes.
Look at that. The big guy didn't even know how right he was. He'd leave for the WWF, with the WCW choosing to scrub his title victory altogether, and not acknowledging it as a part of their own history. Which wouldn't be the last time that a company refused to acknowledge Benoit's accolades. More on that later. Leaving with him from WCW was Benoit's close friends, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn, who'd enter the WWF as the Radicals. They'd enter the company as friends of Mick Foley, but after losing their tryout matches through no faults of their own, in order to properly attain company contracts, they'd turn on Mick and align themselves with the boss's son-in-law. Which isn't a bad idea, as nepotism has always been big in wrestling. Way to use your heads, boys. And Chris, hey, maybe use your head a little bit less. Just a little bit. The team would disband quietly sometime after, but it was clear for all those paying attention that Benoit was booked as the breakout star. He'd win his first title with the company relatively quickly, in a match with Chris Jericho and Intercontinental Champion Kurt Angle. Two men that he'd have more than a handful of memorable matches with. The match was a triple threat match that would dictate whoever got the first fall would become European champion.
The first fall will be for the World Wrestling Federation Intercontinental Championship.
And whoever got the second fall would become Intercontinental Champion.
And the second fall will be for the WWF European Championship.
Wrong! Funnily enough, Jericho would win his European title by pinning Benoit.
Angle avoided that headbutt. And no, Jericho. No, wait a minute. No.
And Benoit would win his IC title after pinning Jericho.
Oh boy, Jericho down. On the top. Well, this way.
Meaning that Kurt Angle would lose both his championships without ever being pinned. Yeah, tough break, guy, but that's the business. Sometimes you just fail through no fault of your own. Benoit would then go on to main event the pay-per-view Fully Loaded, taking on The Rock for his WWF Championship in what looked to be a winning effort, until that decision was reversed. He'd then main event that year's Unforgiven, once again competing for the WWF Championship against champion The Rock, but with Kane and Undertaker also thrown into the picture as well, in which it would appear that he'd win the title yet again, until that decision was reversed. Obviously foreshadowing much later in his career when all his title wins would be reversed. Or, just scrubbed from existence. Between the months of April of 2000 and January 2001, Benoit would win the Intercontinental Championship 3 times in a feud with Chris Jericho. A feud which Jericho attributes to giving him some of his greatest matches. Which is saying something. The two had an incredible amount of chemistry, probably from their years spent working together, from their time in NJPW and WCW alike. Despite working each other in more than a handful of matches over the years, they hadn't worked in such prominent matches, let alone on a consistent basis. But I personally believe that these matches elevated both men's careers and both men's place in the company. The Radicals would disband and briefly reform, at first to face the McMahon-Helmsley Alliance, and then to eventually join them working as their protection. Not long into their second run together, Benoit would take his leave, in order to focus on having the matches of his career with Kurt Angle. I want to make this clear, I use the word competitors a lot when talking about wrestling, because I personally think it sounds a hell of a lot better than sports entertainers, or superstars. And these two guys are the epitome of competitors. Every time they got into the ring to face each other, that's what you got from them. A competition. The two, time and time again, took each other to their limits, both in story and real life. Their matches, much like Benoit and Bret's, were some of the greatest of either man's career. And that's saying something considering how legendary both careers had become. At the time, Kurt was aligned with the brothers, who were only brothers when it's convenient for booking, Edge and Christian. And the three made for quite the trio for audiences, and quite a pain in the ass for those who they'd encounter. The three-man team proved to be too much for the Crippler, and in turn, the Rabid Wolverine stopped being a lone wolf, teaming with his real-life friend and former on-screen rival, Chris Jericho, so that they could take their revenge on the Not Brothers. And after beating the future world champions, the two would set their sights higher up on the card. The two Chris's took on two of the biggest names at the time and maybe of all time in Stone Cold Steve Austin and Triple H for their tag team championships. The match was an impressive showing from all men, and it would end with Chris and Chris crowned as the new tag team champions. The team had just as much chemistry as partners as they had as opponents, and looked like they were in for a lengthy title run. Unfortunately, that would not be the case. The two successfully defended their titles in the first ever Fatal 4 Tables, Ladders, and Chairs match, competing against the three teams who competed in the first two legendary TLC matches. That being Edge and Christian, the Dudley Boys, and the Hardy Boys. During the match, Benoit would go to land a flying headbutt through a table, but missed, injuring his neck pretty badly, but still somehow not taking him out of commission. He'd even return later to finish the match after being taken out of it, which wasn't part of the plan. That was a legitimate injury, and Benoit legitimately being a tough son of a bitch. His pride wouldn't let him sit out the rest of the match. He needed to bring it to its close. So it was written, so it shall be. And if my memory serves me correctly, Chris wouldn't even miss a day of work. No, he'd instead continue to defend his title until they'd eventually lose them to the Dudley Boys. The team of Jericho and Benoit would begin to feud along with newly tagged single, Stone Cold, ending with Benoit losing in a triple threat. This would lead to Benoit taking some very much needed time off to heal. But on the bright side, this injury would allow him to skip the entire Invasion story, so, a silver lining. While he was out on injury, he was the third man drafted by SmackDown, only to then re-debut on Raw, and then shortly after be drafted back to SmackDown. Sure, makes sense to me. He'd beat Rob Van Dam to gain another Intercontinental title reign. He'd beat Rob Van Dam to gain another Intercontinental title reign. He'd beat Rob Van Dam to gain another Intercontinental title reign. And team back up with former Radical Eddie Guerrero. That alliance wouldn't last, as he'd soon find himself on the opposite side of the ring from Eddie. More on that very soon. You see, Eddie's nephew Chavo would debut with the company, leading to the two teaming together as Los Guerreros. And Benoit would find himself teaming with a former rival, yet again, this time in Kurt Angle. But, you know, not before first feuding with him all over again. The team would consistently feud with Los Guerreros and the makeshift team of Edge and Rey Mysterio. You guys forget about them? That was a thing. Over SmackDown's brand new tag team titles, of which Benoit and Angle would become the inaugural champions. They later lose the belts to Edge and Mysterio and never managed to win them back, thus ending their alliance. Which is actually sad because the two worked well together both in-ring and backstage. They were brilliant performers who knew how to entertain fans and make everything that they did look legitimate. And backstage, their promos always entertained. Angle's cartoony personality mixed with Benoit's concrete face was just an amazing combination. Now, the one thing that should be acknowledged about Chris is that for as good as he was in the ring, he was equally awful out of it. What I mean is, the guy was a wrestler and not a sports entertainer, as previously stated. I mean, sure, the guy could cut a promo if you needed him to be menacing, but when put in situations to play out in front of a camera, he was the most awkward semi-celebrity I think I've ever seen. See the following, for example.
Well, I have more hair than you.
Okay, no matter how you look at it, tonight, you and I have to function as a team, a tag team.
Chris Jericho, I have got to hand it to you.
Maybe your report card red does not get along with others. Maybe you were the last one picked at kickball.
At Royal Rumble, you'll give it your all, and you'll give it all you got.
Well, I'm better than you. I'm better than you. Well, I'm 10 times better than you. I'm 11 times better than you.
After their breakup, Angle would become WWE Champion, with Benoit challenging for the belt. And despite coming out in a losing effort, it was still an incredible match to add to their long line of incredible matches. The two always put on a good show when they were looking across the ring from each other, with Kurt Angle actually crediting Benoit as being one of the top 3 performers he's ever shared a ring with. Following this loss, Benoit would head back to the tag team division, in a very underrated team with Rhino. While they played well off each other as characters and workers alike, their time together didn't gain the team any gold, and doesn't really hold too many fond memories. The team would feud following their breakup,
as is of course the tradition,
which really wouldn't get either man anywhere. Eventually, a tournament was held for the brand new WWE United States Championship, with Benoit and Eddie Guerrero being the last 2 men competing. Unfortunately for Benoit, Guerrero would win the match, earning his place in history, while Benoit would continue to chase the title after in a failed effort. At that year's Survivor Series, Benoit would join Angle's team of himself, Bradshaw, Hardcore Holly, and John Cena, as they took on Brock Lesnar's team of himself, Big Show, Nathan Jones, A-Train, and Matt Morgan. Angle's team would win that match, with Benoit making Brock Lesnar tap out, which is something not a lot of men can say. Or, you know, at least not honestly. Paul Heyman, being Brock's manager and SmackDown's general manager, would hold a vendetta against the winners of the match, which would lead to him trying to keep them away from the next big thing's big gold belt. And it would also lead to...
You want this thing fair and square! Come on.
That's got Heyman! Oh, yeah! Come on now, guys!
I'm leaving!
Not too much force down! You gotta be careful here, Benoit! John Cena! They call that sharpshooter! Heyman's in a lock!
That hurts, doesn't it?
I'm sorry! Oh, God, help me!
Cena's right! Go get him, John! Yeah! Oh, yeah!
You're in what we would like to call a compromising position. All I got to do is say the word, Chris. Oh, snap! I'll lick the soap, Paul.
No, I'm not gonna lick that soap.
Chris?
No! Listen, I can make things really easy for you. Chris, I'm sorry.
You said Chris! You said Chris! Chris?
Oh, yeah! You don't do this to a man like me! You don't! You don't make a fool out of a man like me! First of all, Chris, I'm so sorry for everything I've done to you.
I thought he said Chris, didn't he? Chris?
Benoit would face Lesnar in a match for the title, but the match would end with Benoit passing out from the Brock Lock. Lesnar's forgotten, unloved finisher, for good reason. Heyman would continue punishing Benoit by making him entry number 1 in that year's Royal Rumble. And to the shock of everyone, somehow, despite the odds being stacked against him, he lasted 29 other men to win that match. This win gave him a guaranteed World Championship match, though it didn't say it needed to be the title of the brand he worked for, giving Benoit the chance to head to Raw and compete for their World Championship. Now at the time, Shawn Michaels and World Champion Triple H were having a heated blood feud, which consisted of highly acclaimed grudge matches for that very championship. And with their last match being deemed a draw, Shawn thought that he belonged in the main event of WrestleMania. So naturally, he inserted himself into it, making that year's main event Shawn Michaels versus Triple H versus Chris Benoit. The three had what many wrestling fans consider to be the greatest triple threat match of all time, with Chris finally winning the big one the right way at the grandest stage of them all. In the main event, the match was incredible and is immortalized in the minds of marks and smarks alike. It was a great effort from all three men, and truthfully, there are no words that can do it justice. It needs to be seen to be believed. Whatever I'm saying now is not going to convey the emotion and the story that was told within that match. And the best part of it is, when I was younger, I remember everyone talking about this, wondering if Triple H would retain the title or if Shawn Michaels was finally going to win it back. Benoit was just kind of seen as an add-on to their story, you know, just something to freshen the match up. He wasn't a main component, he was just an accessory. But oh, how wrong they all were. Because the Canadian Crippler had tapped out the company's big bad, Triple H, and was now the Red Brand's world champion. Equally memorable to the match that provided moment after moment after moment was its ending, which saw Eddie Guerrero, Benoit's best friend and current WWE champion, celebrating together in the ring. These were two men who were told their entire careers that they were never destined to make it past the mid-card. They weren't stars, they were just wrestlers. And now here they were, top guys with titles they were told were unattainable to them. Benoit, Shawn, and H would actually have a rematch, probably due to the success of their first outing. And while the match wasn't as good, I think that in its own right, it's definitely serviceable. It doesn't detract from their colossal first encounter, and on its own, you know, it's pretty good. The match ended this time with the Heartbreak Man. Seriously, he's in his 40s here. We can't keep calling him HBK. It's weird. Not as weird as seeing him enter to that theme song when he's 50, but still weird nonetheless. The match ended with Shawn Michaels tapping out this time as opposed to the game. Benoit's problems with Triple H would lead to problems with the whole faction of Evolution, leading Benoit to team with Edge, and winning the titles off Ric Flair and Batista. So now, in addition to being world champion, Benoit was also one half of the tag team champions, which only further proved how much stock the company had in him at the time. This also meant that he'd be pulling double duty, as he'd find himself in feuds with Kane and La Resistance. He'd eventually lose the belts to the French team previously mentioned, and would continue to defend his title until he eventually lost it to Orton, making Orton the youngest world champion at the time. Which is a huge monumental moment for his career, so naturally he'd lose it very quickly to Triple H after. Edge and Benoit would win the titles back due to strange circumstances at Taboo Tuesday, but would lose the belts back to them just 2 weeks later. The team of Benoit and Edge would split up when it came time for that year's Survivor Series, with Benoit joining Team Orton and Edge joining Team H. During the match, Edge would pin his former partner, though Orton's team would be the ones to win the match. Edge and Benoit would feud from that point on, having a good series of matches before they'd compete in the first ever Money in the Bank match, which Edge would win. Their rivalry would continue with Edge winning a last man standing match after knocking the Wolverine out with a brick. See? I've been telling everybody that they've been making way too much noise about that whole cinder block incident. This is a true and tried old method in wrestling. Does nobody remember the phrase, using everything but the kitchen sink? Benoit headed to SmackDown, where an ECW invasion of sorts was taking place. Being an ECW original, he'd of course align himself with the dead brand, taking part in ECW rules matches and competing at the reunion show, Ecw One Night Stand. It was at this event that he'd face best friend Eddie Guerrero in a match that, quite frankly, was a bit of a letdown. I mean, at least in comparison to what they could have done. The match wasn't one that I'd consider bad, but it definitely falls below the mark of what would be expected from these two great athletes. Though there might have been a reason for that. You see, Eddie was very visibly pissed off during this match. And that wasn't part of his heel gimmick. He wasn't trying to sell a story, he was just really pissed off about having to do this show at all. You see, Eddie was in the midst of a heel run, and he didn't feel it appropriate that he lose so cleanly. Despite this being a match against his best friend, and this match taking place at a show that was really only semi-canon. This affected his performance, which visibly frustrated Benoit during the show. At the end of the match, Eddie can be seen somewhat apologizing to Benoit, telling him that he owes him one. Unfortunately, he'd never make good on that promise, as Eddie would pass away that November, with the two never facing each other again. Eddie's death took a toll on Benoit, which could be seen during the tribute show, in which the usually stern SOB was reduced to a sob, not able to get words out but instead wails of pain. While everyone on the main roster could be seen torn apart from the death of one of their own, Benoit was by far the most affected, and this is including Eddie's nephew Chavo and his close friend Rey Mysterio.
Eddie Guerrero is my best friend. Such a beautiful person, such a kind-hearted person, and I know that you're looking down on me right now. I want you to know that I love you. I miss you. You made such a great impression on my life, and I want to thank you for everything you've ever given me. I want to thank you from my heart and tell you that I love you and I'll never forget you.
That same week on SmackDown, Benoit would defeat Triple H in a tribute match to Eddie, where they'd continue to pay him respect following it. The very few who are close to Chris remarked that he was never the same after his friend's passing.
And now we'll see each other again. I love you, Eddie.
Benoit would win the US title from Orlando Jordan right before Eddie's passing in an impressive 25 seconds, which could highlight how much they thought of Chris, or how little was thought of Orlando Jordan.
I made him tap out in 25 and a half seconds. I'm gonna make a cup of coffee.
Oh, no! Clean break! Back!
I won again.
20 seconds. Time! Reset that clock, Josh, because I'm about to go out and beat Orlando Jordan again.
Benoit's next feud would be against former rival Booker T, where they'd rehash their best-of-7 series. The feud looked like it was off to a good start, with both men putting on solid performances just as they had years prior. During this series, both men would suffer injuries, with Benoit's looking particularly horrific. Despite this, it wouldn't be Benoit that took time off, but instead Booker T. The series would continue with Booker T choosing Randy Orton, the man who took the world title off Benoit, to continue it in his place, which Orton would win, with help from Booker, Sharmell, and Orlando Jordan. Guess he was good for something. Of course, Benoit would win the title back from Booker T, making him tap out to his cripple across face, so all's well that ends well. Benoit would then feud with JBL before taking some time off to heal nagging injuries. But he'd return to defend Mysterio's honor when Chavo Guerrero and Vicky, Eddie's wife, were feuding with him. He'd also win the US title back off Mr. Kennedy. The feud was short-lived, but mentioned Eddie at every chance they got, which was uncomfortable for a lot of fans. Following this, Benoit would engage in a feud with MVP for his US title, and after defending the title almost a handful of times, including a WrestleMania performance, he'd eventually drop it to him at Judgment Day. ECW was revived as the third brand of the WWE in 2006, and in 2007, Benoit was drafted there to be a mentor of sorts to the up-and-coming talent. He was going to, in some form or fashion, be a trainer while still maintaining a presence in the ring. He was also being groomed to become the brand's major champion, taking on the soon-to-be megastar CM Punk. The match probably would have been considered a dream match. I mean, could you just imagine what these two could do in a ring together? But unfortunately, that dream would not be seen all the way through, and instead, a nightmare would unwind on the Benoit family and the world of wrestling. More on that later. So with that being said, I'm the social injustice warrior V Infuso, and if you like the words that came out of my mouth hole and you too want to become a VTard, don't forget to like and subscribe. There's plenty more where this video came from. Follow me on Twitter because, hell, why not? It's not considered stalking if it's on the internet, am I right? And don't forget to join the Discord. I don't have anything catchy to add to that, but just join it. Just go do it. And if you have a free moment of time and a free $1 to spare, then head over to my Patreon, where for just $1, you too could help keep this boat afloat. And if you don't have that $1, but you do have a free moment of time, then hit the share button. It will help me out tremendously.
The V-tart, oh.